Before we finish, I think it's also important to talk briefly about why, at a deeper level, as a matter of moral principle, religious freedom is so important. Why, even if the government didn't actually protect it in the Constitution and in the laws, it ought to do so. Why any just society ought to have, as a priority, the protection of religious freedom and the protection of conscience rights. Now, many people mistakenly think that the basis for religious freedom is relativism. Right, in this attitude, there's really no truth in matters of religion. It's just about opinions or preferences or feelings. Or if there is a truth about such things, we really can't know it. And so we should just let people do what they want. Religion on this view is kind of like your favorite ice cream flavor or maybe more like your career choice. Some religions suit some people better, others suit others better, and that's that. So we leave people free to do what they like. Of course, that's not the true basis for religious freedom. And in fact, if religion were just a preference or a lifestyle choice, as many people think that it is, that would actually take away the reason for giving it special protection. Perhaps the treatment of religion as a hobby is precisely the reason why people are now having a hard time understanding why infringements on religious freedom are such a big deal, or why people with religious objections, or understanding why people with religious objections have a special right to an exemption from laws that burden them. The true basis for freedom of religion, the reason why religious freedom is a moral right and not just a legal right granted to us by our government, is that as human beings, we have a grave obligation to seek the truth and to follow the truth as we understand it. As Blessed John Henry Newman famously said, conscience has rights because it has duties. He also said that conscience is a stern monitor, not an excuse to do what we feel like, as it's often treated today. Conscience rights go to the core of what it is to be a human person. The capacity to act based not only on desires or instincts or feelings, but on judgments, reasonable judgments about what is good and bad, right and wrong, and the moral responsibility that's inseparable from that capacity. To force a person to act contrary to conscience is to force him to violate his moral integrity. It's an assault on the person at his core, much worse than any merely physical harm. And that's why heroic individuals, including the many martyrs that we venerate in the Church, and even our nation's founders, have chosen to risk or suffer deprivation, imprisonment, and even death, rather than compromise on matters of conscience. Such individuals are inspirations to us all, but the governments that they lived under are not. The key to understanding conscience rights correctly is to recognize that there is a world of difference between a law that makes me do something I don't want to do or don't feel like doing or would rather not do, and a law that makes me do something I think I have an obligation not to do. The former is an annoyance, but the latter is an assault on my moral integrity. I may not want to follow the speed limit at times, perhaps often, but that doesn't give me a claim to be exempted from the law. On the other hand, if I believe that killing animals is morally wrong, no law should force me to serve meat in my business's cafeteria, or give my employees gift certificates to a steakhouse, even if encouraging people to eat more high-protein foods would promote public health. Yet one might ask, why should we treat a religious belief, or any perceived moral obligation differently from a mere desire or preference or lifestyle choice? Why should the law distinguish between, for example, those who sincerely believe that smoking marijuana from time to time will enhance their overall quality of life, and those who, like the plaintiffs in the Smith case, believe that they have a religious obligation to ingest peyote in a sacramental context? This requires stepping back to understand the purpose and the aim of just laws. Laws exist to promote the common good, which includes the good, the well-being of all the individual members of society. Human well-being is perfectly compatible with, indeed it often requires, very often requires, acting against your preferences and desires. Even reasonable preferences often have to be set aside if one is to form and follow a coherent plan of life, remain faithful to commitments, favor and foster the common good of one's communities, treat others fairly, and generally abide by moral norms that structure and guide practical decision-making in accordance with requirements for genuine human flourishing, for the genuine flourishing of the human person understood integrally. Thus, when following the law, which serves the common good, when that requires one to act against one's preferences, no harm to one's well-being is necessarily involved. Of course, that doesn't mean that justice places no limits on the extent to which, or the way in which, law restricts the pursuit of our preferences. In order to serve its function of promoting the common good, the law also has to avoid unreasonably restricting individual liberty, even with regard to the pursuit of reasonable preferences. And the law should also try to avoid unfairness in distributing the benefits and the burdens of common life, among which are inevitable restrictions on our freedom. But unlike failing to act on a reasonable preference, failing to act on an obligation, failing to follow your conscience, that's always incompatible with the overall well-being of the human person. And that's true even when you're objectively wrong about the content of your obligations. That's the case because a moral act is not just a physical chunk of behavior, but a moral act is specified by what your will is choosing when you're choosing to act. And an act is good whenever your will in choosing that action is really good, which means that it's aiming at a genuine good in line with your overall well-being as a human person. So if Mr. Smith in the Native American church peyote smoking case, if Mr. Smith believes that, for example, ingesting peyote in a sacramental context is morally obligatory, and if he chooses not to do that, then he is, among other things, choosing not to fulfill a moral obligation. He's choosing not to follow his conscience. And that's always bad, even if he's wrong about the fact that it's morally obligatory to smoke peyote, which I think that he is, but nonetheless, I respect his right to follow his conscience there. Now, because fulfilling a moral obligation is a basic, central aspect of human well-being at its core, a direct choice not to fulfill your obligations, a direct choice to go against your conscience, is always a bad choice. The exact content of your obligation is irrelevant. What matters is that, from the perspective of the agent, from the perspective of you as the person who's acting, who's faced with a demand on your conscience, to go against that demand is always to make yourself into a worse person, to make yourself into a person who lacks moral integrity. Of course, in the face of laws that prohibit you from fulfilling your obligations, you could still choose to fulfill your obligation and face the legal penalty. Especially when the penalty is severe, that choice is heroic. But laws, which aim to foster the common good, should not create powerful incentives for individuals to act against their genuine well-being. Laws shouldn't, in other words, force us to be heroic in order to maintain our moral integrity. Instead, they should foster the maintenance of moral integrity, insofar as that's a part of their overall job of fostering the common good. Furthermore, laws that forbid individuals to act in accordance with the dictates of their consciences place a burden on those individuals that differs not only in degree, but in kind, from the sort of burden that's involved when a law forbids you from acting in accordance with your preferences, even if those preferences are very strong. Such laws, even when, like the Oregon drug laws at issue in the Smith case, even when they're otherwise reasonable, they still fail to distribute the benefits and burdens of common life fairly. Individuals whose consciences are burdened by a law therefore have a claim of justice to an exemption from that law, although that claim might be defeated in cases where granting it would be incompatible with the protection of others' fundamental rights or the preservation of public order. And that brings us back to my point about unnecessarily burdening conscience and to the standards set up by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is that the government needs to avoid burdening religion unless it's the only way to achieve a compelling government interest. So, one might make the counter-argument, returning to the HHS mandate debate, that others' fundamental rights are at stake in this controversy. Many people believe that what's really at issue here is a woman's right to control her own body. And further, just to put the case on that side as strongly as possible, perhaps some individuals believe themselves to have an obligation to use artificial birth control, and thus their conscience rights are at stake as well. Yet even if we take both of these to be valid rights claims, and I think there's some doubt on that score, nonetheless, even if we grant those arguments, it still only takes a moment's reflection to realize that rescinding the mandate would violate neither of those rightful claims. Rescinding the mandate would not make contraception illegal. Those who want to use it or believe themselves to have an obligation to use it remain free to do so at, I might add, rather negligible financial cost. $9 at Target or Walmart or something per month is not really something that will break the bank for anybody. And even if you have a fundamental right to do something, that certainly doesn't imply that you have a fundamental right to have the government foot the bill. As a Catholic, I think I have an obligation and therefore a fundamental right to attend Mass on Sundays, but I'm not about to tell the government to pay for my transportation. And so even if the government believes that promoting artificial birth control use is a compelling state interest, so compelling that it ought to be promoted by removing all possible disincentives, including negligible financial ones, that goal could easily be pursued in other ways that don't burden the conscience rights of other citizens. So clearly, it fails the test of being a compelling state interest that is furthered by the narrowest, least burdensome means possible. So where does this all leave us? Right, it's clear that there are grave, serious, growing threats to religious freedom in our nation today. It's also clear that it's no exaggeration to claim that religious freedom is indeed under fire. To preserve our rights and the rights of every citizen, we need to make our voices heard here. Ignorance and complacency are our worst enemies. James Madison offered some words of advice to his fellow patriots after the Revolution that are as relevant today as they were then. He said, "It is proper to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens, and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution. The free men of America did not wait until usurped power had strengthened itself by exercise and entangled the question in precedents. They saw all the consequences in the principle, and they avoided the consequences by denying the principle." In other words, they jumped the gun and stopped the incursions on liberty by the British Crown before they got too strong. Likewise for us, love for our country, in addition to fidelity to God, require us to be courageous and make our voices heard in defense of our most fundamental right to freedom of religion. The Pope, in speaking to American bishops about the current threats to religious liberty in the United States, said that to counter these alarming trends, what we need is, quote, "an engaged, articulate, well-formed Catholic laity, endowed with a strong critical sense vis-a-vis the dominant culture, and with courage to counter a reductive secularism which would delegitimize the Church's participation in public debate about the issues which are determining the future of American society." In other words, what the Pope's saying is, it's up to us, to you, and to me. We need to make the effort to stay informed. And we also need to go out of our comfort zone, complicate our lives a bit. Talk to family members, friends, colleagues. Get into those conversations which aren't always pleasant, but which have to happen if we're going to inform people. Write letters to the editor. Call and write your elected officials. And, if you feel the call and have the capacity, even get more directly involved in the politics of these issues. It's important as well not to limit our correspondence with elected officials to negative criticism. We need to encourage and support those elected officials who are fighting against the mandate and fighting for religious freedom on all fronts, because they feel very alone in Washington. They've said so often. The people, for example, like Roy Blunt and Darrell Issa, Jeff Fortenberry, who tried back in late winter, early spring to get this mandate overturned or get a law passed that would protect conscience rights. That law failed, unfortunately, but they said they felt so alone in Washington because everybody just forgot about them, and the people on their side forgot about them. The people against them didn't forget about them and hounded them with hate mail. And so we need to make it clear to them that their constituents are on their side, that they do have the majority of people in support of their efforts to protect religious liberty, which the polls show, in fact, that they do. So, just to finish up, I'll leave us with a thought from Edmund Burke, who said famously, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing." The HHS mandate, together with the many other threats to religious freedom in our nation today, are grave evils. They are unprecedented attacks on our moral and constitutional rights. And we'll succeed in protecting our freedom only if each one of us does our part. So we need to speak, write, vote, stay informed, and of course pray. Pray for our political leaders, for all citizens, that we be valiant defenders of the fundamental principles upon which this nation was founded, and by which, God willing, it will continue to prosper.